Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to a live session of The Only You. Dr. Patino had a wonderful vacation over the last week or so he was not around to chat with us. Hope you had a good vacation, Dr. Patino. But today we're going to be talking about an issue that's in the news, and that is the tragedy of the Tyre Nichols death. And looking at it from a perspective other than political or, I mean, a little bit sociological, but mainly psychological. And Doctor, you sent me some articles prior to the show, as per usual, about something called self-hatred. Could you explain to the listeners what that is and how it's associated with this specific tragedy?
It's very interesting. And at first, let me say I had a great vacation. I didn't want to come back. I am back, so I'm back to my routine. And I miss doing this. I really like it. Um, so I get back and I find that we're back to our normal selves in terms of violence and people getting killed and the police. And we've had these discussions before, but I wanted to look at it from a different perspective. And not to justify any of the things that have happened, but some of the issues that kind of resonate with this particular case is that the victims and the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators are the same culture, same background, right? And that has raised a number of different questions from cultural issues, from sociological issues, from psychological issues, from hiring practices, all kinds of different things that may have gotten together to create a time bomb, right? But from the psychological point of view, self-hatred is not a it's not a concept we use very much in psychiatry or psychology much anymore. That is moving to talking about self-esteem, right? But when we talk about groups, it's better to use the word self-hatred because it's easier to understand. And whether it's an individual or a group, you get into the issue of self-esteem dynamics. And then how does self-hatred or self-esteem deficiencies translate into violence, right?
Hmm.
Uh, because you and I were talking about this, and even though the victim and the perpetrators are in the same culture, some racial groups, right? Is this only an issue of policing? Is this only an issue of culture within the police? Is this an issue of the police protecting themselves? And all of those things play a role. But what I was trying to tell you before was that these police officers were in a racial group and in a culture before they became police officers.
Hmm.
And that's where you get into the issue of how something like this happens. Now, this particular case is pretty heinous in terms of, and I watched the videos and all that, in terms of the passionate abuse that was being expressed by the police officers. And that's where the issue of self esteem and hatred came into my mind, right? I mean, to what extent, and I'm going to put it in general terms, when they're beating him up, they're also beating themselves up.
Why is
To
that?
what extent? To what extent that is a projection of their sense of lack of value themselves, right? Which, interestingly enough, is a dynamic that we see a lot in domestic violence, right? Um, you are justifying me beating you, even though I love you, right? Even though we're in the same culture, even though we're in the same race, you get into the issue of you actually have lost the ability to recognize your value to the point of having no values, right? Because the person in front of you is an object now, is not a human being.
Hmm.
That doesn't justify it, and I'm not saying they're mentally ill or anything like that. I'm just saying those are the dynamics that frequently happen in violent situations.
It's interesting you say that because in my other world where I've trained people who do violence for a profession, that's something that does come up. We talk about the ability to turn off and turn on that ability to project violence. And it's always something discussed as part of the job. and something that has no emotion associated with it. So it's not crimes of passion or shootings of passions or whatever it is. It's literally, surgical precision. So in this case, though, it seems quite the opposite. It's all about that passion. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, let me present it this way. And we've talked about these things before in the individual side, okay, in which a person who suffers from low self-esteem or suffers from poor self-image reacts to the denial of acknowledgement of you as a person with violence, right? Example. Let me give an example, of passionate example of a narcissistic injury. I'm the police officer. I'm telling you to lay down, right? And you don't lay down. You disrespecting me. That's actually something we hear quite often. And
Mhm.
because you disrespect me, I had to beat you up, right? Another example in a relationship side will be a man walking into a room and the person having narcissistic vulnerabilities, meaning low self esteem, and find his wife in bed with another man and he shoots them both, right? Passionately. And you wonder, if you ask him later on, how come you shot him? He didn't shoot him because they were having sex. He shot him because they were doing it to him. And that is what creates this passionate reaction. So it's not difficult in a culture like police, okay, or in a culture where you have been chronically neglected and rejected, to have this sense that I have to be recognized.
Mhm.
And the only way you can find a way to be recognized is by borrowing image from a different group, in this particular case, the police. So now that I'm the police, I have power, and and my power should generate respect. And if you don't, you're questioning me as a human being, and I'm going to beat you up.
Hmm. And,
Now,
and, let, and let's be clear, it is going beyond their duty to arrest somebody. I mean, if someone doesn't follow the orders, a police officer is allowed to go hands on and put someone down or taser them. But really, we're not seeing that. We're seeing actually people literally beating the hell out of somebody. It seems very punitive, not about I'm trying to take a person to custody. Those are different things.
yes, I mean that you can hear in the videotape this guy's yelling at the victim, "Lay down!" He's laying down. Put your
Yeah.
hands behind your back. He's got his hands behind your back, and they keep beating him up. That's passionate. That is my discharge of my anger and frustration, not only because he's not following my orders and disrespecting me, but I'm reflecting all of this lack of value that I have into this person. Okay. Now, I mean, usually in those kinds of situations, you can almost get a little dissociated, right? That you really don't know what you're doing for a little while. And you can see that after a while, when they all realize what they've done, they're kind of aimlessly walking around, not knowing what to do, right?
Yeah, that lack of loss of control, and then when that comes back, and the realization that hey, I let things get out of hand, emotional versus again very surgical, that could be a difficult thing. I know personally, and the people I've worked with, it takes a very special type of person to do that. I mean, and everybody has a button that can be pushed. However, I will say this: I'm dealing with a lot of police officers lately. They seem to be really on edge. So you've mentioned, the culture issue and the issue of a lack of value. So somebody who's already maybe from an ethnic group, in this case, that has that feeling. Lately, I've been hearing that police are feeling persecuted and it's like they're being treated as the enemy. So is that double downing on this whole thing?
Well, I mean, there's a reaction and an overreaction to a situation like this, right? So when you look at the sociological and political components of this, you get into the issue of how we're going to solve the problem versus how we're going to understand the problem. And those two things go hand in hand. You cannot solve without understanding, right? You cannot solve without education. You cannot solve without proper rules. And I think that we have created the last couple of generations, the last 25 years, the idea that we're entitled to disrespect authority, right? And that creates a serious problem for the police because they provides a barrier for them to get closer to the community because they're anticipating disrespect. Now, there are a lot of good cops. I've
Mhm.
seen
Absolutely.
police officers all my life. Some of them have been my patients over the years, right? And they have most of them have pretty good training. I don't know nowadays how careful are we're being on the hiring of police officers, right? Moving away from people who have good values, good motivations, good goals, to just looking for people that have the aggressive tendency, people that have that are strong, big, right? And when you look at that, you're going to have a lot of people who have developed the aggression and their size in response to the lack of self-esteem. So the fact that you're big and you're strong and you play in the NFL or you play basketball or whatever you play or you're an athlete doesn't make you a person with good self-esteem. Actually, it makes you somebody who supports his self-esteem by the success they have, right?
Mhm.
So for some people, not everybody, I would have to say that most police officers have good schooling, good training, good values, regardless of their culture, right? But we're gonna have some people who have a need to be recognized for all the wrong things. Now, it sounds to me that in this particular case, they put a lot of these guys in the same group, right?
Mhm.
The Scorpio group to try to reduce violence on the streets and things of that sort. I mean, you can say that the motivation was laudable. However, the outcome was tragic.
And that's kind of plays into what you said before, the difference between defining the problem and solving the problem. People say, and I think I mentioned this to you before. I said, "Wow, this self-hatred, concept almost sounds like an excuse," and you made that distinction. No, that's part of identifying the problem itself. It's not an excuse, and it's definitely not part of solving it. But you have to understand it first in order to move forward.
Well, you not only you have to understand it, but you have to develop mechanisms to disseminate understanding, right? But that is a two-way street, not only on the police side, but on society side. Because I think that to a high degree, the overreaction from the police, especially those who are vulnerable, is actually immature, right?
Mhm.
But the reaction from society is also immature, right? I mean, and to some degree, is reflecting either change of values or lack of values, right? What is important? At what point do we set up life as the ultimate goal, right? That the respect for life and humanity cannot be justified. I mean, you cannot terminate that for any reason.
So getting back to protect and serve instead of punish and enforce, which it seems
Well,
to have moved to a certain extent. Not all police, I'm with you on that. Um, but real quick, one of the things I read before the show today concerning the body cams, and of course that's a big issue now because of the evidence showing something different than what was written in the reports. But more so, there the article and you sent it to me about how it affects people's behavior. Could you chat about that a little bit?
yeah, I mean, you have an expectation that when people know that they're being watched, they're going to be more restrained, right? Which actually speaks against this situation and supports the possibility that this was very passionate, right? It was very passionate because despite the fact that everybody's got had cameras, the cars, the vehicles had cameras, they kept doing it. I mean, you and I are old enough to remember the Rodney King, right?
Oh yeah.
But back in those days, there were no cameras. It just happened that somebody was videotaping the whole thing, right? Um, and despite that, the guys went free. I mean, they lost a civil lawsuit, the city lost, but they were not convicted. I remember the riots afterwards
Hmm.
and all of that. So we move forward 30 years, and you're still seeing something very similar. Okay, in this particular case, again, passionate. Is the passion associated with the beating that they um, had this kid go through? Is it was intense,
Mm.
almost dissociative, if you may.
So, what is the solution? I mean, other than going to RoboCop and making it totally logic based and taking the amount, because I mean that's the reality, right? You put humans in stressful situations, they don't always respond well. And I know from personal experience with the training of police, they are well trained, but there's a whole lot more that could be done to help them, and even just in their assessment of hiring people. I mean, how do you take out the human, or at least manage the human factor?
Well, um, you have to use the carrot and the stick approach, right? But before you get there, you have to do a good internal, honest analysis of your assets and deficits, right? And I'm basically telling you what we do with patients, right? I mean, whether it's therapy, whether it's couples therapy, family therapy. My first approach is that what do I have to work with, not who is my problem, right? Because you have to know your assets and how to build from your assets. What happens though is that politically, there's a very strong pressure to suppress, right? Let's eliminate the problem, but you cannot eliminate the culture, right? So you have to listen to your to your assets. You need to listen to the good cops and ask the question, you know, how can I help you be a better police officer? Instead of directing. And there's been a change in culture. You and I have seen this probably since the first Gulf War, in the militarization of the police departments, right? In which everything is top down, and I'm going to tell you how to do it, and some good ideas, some bad ideas, but a lot more military-like type of interventions, right? So interventions to suppress with the removal of community policing, right? And I don't have these big dreams about community policing, but the police officers in the community need to be part of the community, meaning that, and you remember the times, that when there was a police officer at the corner, you could stop by and ask for directions. I mean, I was in Europe. I was in Spain a couple of weeks ago, and while I was there, there was this couple of police officers with big rifles. They're obviously military people. And I'm walking down the street, and I say, "Well, I didn't know if I should approach him or not to ask him for directions, right?" So I say, "Well, I'm going to take my risk, and I'm going to ask him, where can I go?" Very happy, very friendly. "Oh, don't worry about it. You see that flag, just follow this road, blah, blah, blah." We don't have that here. Everybody's in a patrol car or in a SWAT team vehicle, carrying arms, not talking to anybody, and that is not working.
Mm.
And then everybody's showing off. I mean, I was following a couple of police officers the other day in their motorcycles, and they both have rifles in the back.
Yep, AR-15s now. Yep, that they do.
Why?
Well, the thought is they will need them. I talked to a person recently who's trying to become a police officer, and he's a former military guy. And I remember him saying, I said something about, you know, getting in these engagements, and he says, "Well, that's part of the fun of being a cop." And it really hit me that I'm like, I don't think I want you being a cop then. Um, and I know that right now we have a lot of people exiting that. And it seems like any economic system or even system in nature, once a vacuum is created, something will fill it. Ideally, somebody more geared toward the protect and serve, communications, maybe even some more hands-on skills versus this, hey, let's just go to guns every time. Do you think there's a possibility of that, or on what you've been seeing and hearing?
You see, we need to move away from the idea that what you do defines you as a human being. Whether it's being a doctor, being a police officer, being a psychologist, or an engineer, you're not a good person because of what you do. You do what you do because you're a good person. And we need to start there, right? That we have people with good values that are willing to do a difficult job, and we need to give them the tools to do it properly, right? But we need to move away from the idea that the best I can do my job, the best I am as a human being. And then everything starts with values. I'm a good person, I'm caring, loving, kind, compassionate, but I can also be firm and I can be assertive, right? And I can be insulted, and it doesn't mean that I'm not worth anything. So I'm telling you this because that's what I have to do as a psychiatrist. Sometimes I have to let people ventilate their anger and frustration and tell me that I don't know anything, that what I'm doing, that I'm the worst doctor they've ever seen. If I feel injured because of what they're saying, I'm going to punish them,
Mm,
right? And it's not my job to punish people, it's my job to understand. The only job of the police is to make people follow the law, okay? And to do it with at least aggression as possible, with least threat as possible, and without a need to impose our authority, with aggression. It's actually, in the long term, a lot easier to impose authority without aggression,
hmm
right?
Indeed. Well, hopefully, that's what's happening now in some of our PDs, the new recruitment to fill in these people who are leaving, who maybe are not the best fit, and unfortunately that they'll add some psychological aspects to it as well as some other physical training aspects to help um, deter more of these issues from occurring. Once again, Doctor, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you
Thank
all
you.
again next week.
Hey, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being with you again, and we'll see you next week.